106.5 FM and online. It's the After 5 Guest with Win Thomas.
Now, a new book comes out, it's just come out recently, called Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. The Two Dylans. KG is written by KG Miles and my guest today, Jeff Towns. Jeff, thanks for coming along to see me.
Thank you for having me.
How about come with that microphone a bit more for me?
Sure.
There we go.
Thanks
okay.
for having me.
Okay. What I found incredible was the number of links between the two men. Were you surprised at that?
I was. I've been messing around with Two Dylans since about 1995, 2000, when Bob Dylan was 70. A Swansea academic, Dave Boucher, he's from Aberdeen, but he lives in Swansea, at Cardiff University, threw a birthday party for Bob Dylan. And I got on the stage with him and Michael Gray, a big Bob Dylan academic, and we talked about the Two Dylans then. But at that point, we never got much further than the name. You know, Bob Dylan was born Robert Zimmerman. We all know that he changed his name to Bob Dylan in homage to our poet. He denied it for a long while. So I've been doing it for a long while, and I knew about the name and I knew a few other things. But when I met Keith Miles, my co-author, who'd written a book about Bob Dylan in London and another book about Bob Dylan in New York, we met in a Tenby pub through a mutual friend, and he said he had a 4-book deal with his publisher. And I said, oh yeah, what's the next one? And he said, it's supposed to be Bob Dylan in Japan. But he was struggling a bit because there's only the Budokai concert, and he had no contacts in Japan. He couldn't get to Japan. And he just looked at me and he said, you know, the book I'd really like to write is Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas. And I nearly fell off my chair. I said, well, Keith, half of that book's probably on my computer already. And so we got talking. He went back to his publishers. They liked the idea, and we got down to it. And as I got into it, the number of connections I found astounded me.
Yeah.
And some of the stories I found were almost sign of eureka moments. When I was struggling to find something, I'd suddenly, just by luck, come across something and find a real link and a story. There's we're not trying to make any huge point about this. I mean, Dylan Thomas lived to 39. He was just under 40 when he died. Bob Dylan's still going at 80, coming up for 82, I think. So, and they were miles apart. I mean, I was 5 when Dylan Thomas died in New York. I think I worked out that Bob Dylan was just entering his teens. And so there's no real connections between them. Like, we're not saying that Dylan Thomas influenced Bob Dylan's writing in any way. It's just that they had similar outlooks. I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you now if Bob Dylan, Robert Zimmerman, had called himself Robert Eliot after T.S. Eliot, or Bob Auden after W.H. Auden. He chose Dylan Thomas. And, you know, he's now admitted in his last book that it is Dylan Thomas, and there are other indications. There's a whole chapter in the book about the name and how Dylan got the name and how Bob Dylan took the name. So basically, it's about these connections, and they're kind of synchronicities, they're coincidences, they're 1 degree of separation, but never more than that. So there's 20 odd chapters, and they all stand examination.
So Bob, as you know, his name was in the man. He changed it to Dylan, but it was not his first name change, was it? He'd been said to other people as well.
Well, he liked to have aliases, and he liked to have not nom de plume, a nom de song. So he was Elston Gunn, and he was Blind Boy Grunt. The thing that really got me, after I knew and was convinced that it was after Dylan Thomas, was that he guested on a record when he was under contract for a friend in New York, a guy called Dave Goodman. Somebody Else's Troubles, the LP was called. And Bob played stand-up piano, harmonica, and some backup vocals on a few tracks. So he's on the list of musicians.
Right.
But his nom de song is Robert Milkwood Thomas.
Oh, right.
But, you know, to me, when I saw that, and that's in about 67, I think, something like that, it's QED. You know, he's playing games with us all, but Robert Milkwood Thomas, that's Bob Dylan, and that's how Dylan Thomas, you know.
So then as well, Dylan Thomas, Dylan was an unusual name in those days, wasn't it?
When Keith and I were looking into this, and I've been talking with Keris Matthews about this recently, because she's a big fan of both. Right. And I went to the football with her the other week and we had a great day. She was saying that when DJ Thomas, Dylan's father, plucked that name out of the Mabinogion, or the Mabinogi, whatever, that great book of Welsh heroic Arthurian tales. He picked the name out of there. There wasn't another Dylan in Wales. It was like the first time the name had been used since the Mabinogion. In the Mabinogion, it's Dylan Ton, Dylan, son of wave, and this baby is born when a woman jumps over a stone and dives straight in the sea, and that's Dylan. And it hadn't been used. There's not bardic names. Taliesin, the bardic poet, had a story about this Dylan, but then it went for centuries. But DJ Thomas, being a Welsh speaker, being a scholar, being a poet, that's the name he picked. And the interesting thing is his wife, she was kind of not as educated as him, and she was a sort of farm girl coming to town, but she'd married a school teacher. She thought the pronunciation, if it's done right in Welsh as Dylan, that he would get bullied in school, because the kids would all say, here comes the dull one, here comes the dull one, it's Dylan, here's the old Dylan. But DJ stuck to his guns, and Dylan told his first girlfriend that my name rhymes with chillin', as in all God's children got to sing. And that's how he explained to his girlfriend. And when he went on the BBC, eventually he got a word to them that he wanted to be called Dylan. That sort of anglicised pronunciation. But if you go up to North Wales and if you speak to proper Welsh-speaking people, they find it impossible not to say Dylan, because that's how they say it.
Looking at the Beatles, they must have both be Dylan fans, Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas fans, because those two appear on Sgt. Pepper.
That's right. So there's a chapter in the book on the Sgt. Pepper cover, and the truth of the matter is this: when I was growing up, I bought Sgt. Pepper, and the fact that both of my heroes were on that cover was a huge plus for me. And then a few years later, after Sgt. Pepper came out, and I played it till it played both sides at once. I loved that record, and I loved the record sleeve. It's iconic. I was publishing a Dylan Thomas book and having it printed by a printer in Marlborough. And when I went to see him to get this book printed, he said, I'm printing another Dylan Thomas book. And I said, what's that? He said, I'm doing a very fancy edition of Undermilk Wood, illustrated by Peter Blake. And I knew Peter Blake. Right. And I said this was Michael Mitchell, the printer, lovely man, passed away now. I said to Michael, I'd love to meet Peter. And he said, here's his address, here's his phone number. I ended up going to London, and it turned out Peter Blake was a huge fan of Undermilk Wood. And although this was in about 1987, Peter spent the next nearly 30 years illustrating Undermilk Wood. And then in 2014, this huge exhibition in Cardiff of 170 artworks that Peter Blake did to illustrate Undermilk Wood. It was ridiculous, lifetime, evening times work. He'd get home from his studio and he would cut out collages and he would do all based on Undermilk Wood. And so we became friends, and the book has got a very glamorous cover, I think. It's a wonderful cover.
Yeah, your book is on, isn't it?
The Two Dylans book has got this cover which features a tattooed lady called Tiny Tina. And Peter Blake, he likes tattoos. It's part of pop art for him, tattoos. So he made this life-size collage of tattooed Tina, which he then made into a print. And I decided I needed one. I loved the image. I couldn't afford the original, but the print was one of 100, and Peter signed it. And you could, when you ordered the print, you could pick what colour her bikini was going to be and what colour the bow in her hair was going to be. So each one could be almost unique. And it was lovely. It cost a few quid, but it was worth. I wanted it, and it's hung in my house, and I love it. But I phoned Peter up. I said, Peter, I bought a tattooed Tina. I love it. And he just said to me, have you seen what I've done for you? And I said, no. He said, look above her bikini. And there he's written Bob Dylan Thomas. And he put it there because he knew of my twin obsessions, and he shares these obsessions too. So it's
And
made
now-
a wonderful
and
cover.
now it's
for
on the
the
cover of
book.
your book,
Yeah.
absolutely brilliant. Yeah, yep. Bob Dylan made himself look poor, but he came from a well-to-do Jewish family, didn't he?
Well, they were shopkeepers. They had an electrical goods store
Right.
in the town Hibbing, Minnesota. That's where they were, but they weren't poor for sure. But almost as soon as he started playing the guitar, he started to play around with his own personal history, and has come up with so many stories about running away with the circus and going down to the south and doing this and doing that. But it's hard to pin it down, although people have tried and they're building more of a picture. But he keeps changing the story and changing the time span. He's a law unto himself. But what we do know is that he rocked up in New York and started to play in folk clubs in New York in the sort of early 60s. And the clubs he played folk music in, 10 years before Dylan Thomas, they were the bars that Dylan Thomas went in. So the ghost of Dylan Thomas was still in New York, and they both drank in the White Horse Tavern. Everybody Welsh who goes to New York, everybody likes Dylan Thomas. They try and make the White Horse Tavern, which, praise the Lord, is still going and hasn't changed too much. But Bob played there as well, met the Irish band, the Chieftains, in there. And, that pub figures in both their lives. And there are a couple of occasions when there are people who Bob Dylan met and Dylan Thomas did. And the biggest one for me is the poet Allen Ginsberg, who was the leading light of the Beat generation, along with William Burroughs and Jack Kerouac. So those three, Ginsberg, Kerouac and Burroughs, were the three leading lights of this movement that started in America, the Beat writers. And they have a huge influence, and they still do. There's no doubt about that.
But Bob and Dylan both met, were aligned to poets while they were out there, weren't they?
That's right. Yes, and some of these
in
poets,
their own generation.
That's right.
Yeah.
But Ginsberg met Dylan Thomas in a bar in New York, and he went home after meeting him and wrote it up in his diary. Absolutely word for word, minute by minute, what happened. And it wasn't a good meeting. Dylan was already drunk. Ginsberg wasn't too good. Dylan Thomas asked him if he could work out a sort of sex show for him, and Ginsberg didn't really know what to say, and came away thinking, oh goodness, I had a chance to meet my great poetic hero, and it didn't go well. But he wrote it all up, and then you see eventually he goes on to tour with Bob Dylan and make records with Bob Dylan. So Ginsberg knew Bob really well, but Ginsberg did know Dylan Thomas.
Another connection.
And I knew that Alan had met Bob Dylan Thomas in New York, and then he went on that. In 1995, Ginsberg came to Swansea and did 2 readings, and he came to my bookshop. So I spent the afternoon with Ginsberg, but I was so in awe, and all he wanted to do was to look at books that I had by him that he didn't have, little English pamphlets, and he bought a Mabinogion and he bought some other books. I couldn't bring myself to ask him about his meeting with Dylan Thomas or even Bob Dylan. I was just almost dumbstruck and just trying to be a bookseller to him. But he came to me there, and then I was in San Francisco a little while after that in a friend's bookshop who just bought a big library in San Francisco, and there was a copy of the American first edition of Dylan Thomas's collected poems. It looks quite different to the English one, but it's the same year, 1953. And
that's one of the funny covers, isn't it?
The American one's white and black.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And the English one's yellow and black when it gets a picture on. But to start with, it's pretty drab. This book, I pick it up, I think, that's the first American edition. And in the first edition, there's a misprint on the last page. Daughters is misspelled. So I was going to check that, but I opened it, and on the front fly leaf it said, Allen Ginsberg, New York, 1952. So, and when I flicked through it, Allen Ginsberg had the audacity to add a line of his own poetry to the end of one of Dylan Thomas's greatest poems. So, those kind of things, when you've got that evidence of this friendship, nobody can argue with us writing about how
they knew
Beats
each other
and Ginsberg were so important to each other. And this is one of the name and the Beats are probably the 2 strongest. But then, Dylan Thomas called himself the Rimbaud of Cumdonkin Drive after this crazy French poet who died by the time he was 30, stopped writing poetry when he was 20, was a gun runner, was a drug dealer. Crazy man, Rumbo. Bob Dylan loved Rumbo as well, and writes about him, names in songs. So we kept finding. And what would happen was
So keep on finding. So how about keep on finding about Charlie Chaplin? There was a connection there as well, wasn't there?
Well, so I once was at a book fair in London, and my friend, a good friend, came over to me holding a scruffy-looking green book, and he said, "Jeff, you might like this, and he was a posh boy, Eric Korn, he's passed away now. Jeff, you might like this, and if you don't want it, I'll buy it." And I just looked, I said, "Oh, Eric, that hasn't even got the dust wrapper. It's a scruffy copy of his selected writings. I've got many copies. I don't need it. You should look inside," he said. I opened it up, and on the end paper, in green biro, drunken inscription, LA, Los Angeles. "In love, with love and homage to Charlie Chaplin from Dylan Thomas, November 90, and it fell off the page. So this is the book that Dylan Thomas gave to Charlie Chaplin when he went to a party in his house in Hollywood when he was there on his trip. And then you look at Bob Dylan, and early on in New York when he was in folk clubs, he'd go on stage dressed as Charlie Chaplin. He empathised with this character that Charlie created,
the tramp.
A little tramp and a little underdog, and Dylan's early protest songs, they're coming from this little tramp, that's where he sees it. So you've got a real strong connection there. And a lot of these things, I kind of knew, I would say to myself, Dylan lived for 39 years, which is very short life. I remember when I got to 39, and I was only just getting into my stride, I thought, as a bookseller and doing what I was doing, and there's Dylan Thomas dead in New York, 39. But when you look at his life, and because he only lived, sadly, I'm not laughing about it, because he only lived to 39, and there's a lot of biographies, and he wrote 1,300 letters, so the book of his letters is like a brick, the size of a brick. If you read those letters, and I have, and you read the biographies, you kind of know what Dylan did almost every day. Dylan Thomas did every day of his life. And you knew the events that happened stand out. So I knew that when he was in Boston, he went to Stravinsky. Stravinsky had asked to see him. Stravinsky was staying in his posh hotel called the Copley Plaza, where I once did a book fair, but Dylan went to see Stravinsky because Stravinsky wanted to write an opera with him. So I know that Dylan met Stravinsky. I kind of do a little bit of work, and I see that Bob Dylan, on one of his tours, would play Stravinsky's Rite of Spring to the audience before he came on stage. He didn't have a backup band, it was just him, but he'd make them listen to 10 minutes of Rite of Spring, and they probably didn't really know what was happening. But he liked the fact that when Rite of Spring was first played, there was a riot in the audience. In Paris, the people thought it wasn't music. They couldn't understand what Stravinsky was doing. They'd never heard modern classical music like it. So there was a riot. And Bob Dylan absolutely identified with this from when he went electric, and all these people shouted out Judas, and the sort of riots they had when the folkies who wanted to hear him just singing protest songs with a acoustic guitar, and he comes in with a rock and roll band, which really is what he always wanted to be. Because in his school yearbook, when it says what he wants to be in the future, he says he wants to play with Little Richard. That was what he wanted to do when he was leaving school at 16 or 17.
Let me ask you this one as well. This is a song I've played many times by the Byrds, which is the Bells of Romney. Which there's a connection there with Idris Davis and Bob Dylan. I think Dylan Thomas, isn't there?
There is no, like I said to you, there's no real evidence of Dylan Thomas influencing songs that Bob Dylan sang. No real evidence. Christopher Ricks, the poet, the critic, he says there's a line in Spanish Boots of Spanish Leather about chains and the sea. But you can't put that down to Dylan Thomas's Fern Hill, I sang in my chains like the sea. But there is a line like that. But that's not where we were going. But the thing about the Bells of Romney is Idris Davis, a great coal mining poet, wrote a long, long poem called Gwalia Deserta, which is the Welsh version of The Wasteland. T.S. Eliot wrote The Wasteland. Idris Davis, who was published by T.S. Eliot, Eliot thought Idris Davis was a great poet. So he did this poem called Gwalia Deserter. Dylan Thomas was doing a radio programme and read the bells section, which was just one verse of this book-length poem. But Dylan chose to read that on the radio. When Dylan died, it came out in a book of broadcasts, his recording with that Bells of Rumney printed. And Dylan even introduces it on the radio. Dylan Thomas now introduces it as being Idris Davis come up with this one sweet song. Dylan had already seen it as a song, but there was no music to it. That book got published in America. Pete Seeger bought the book. It's a much more handsome book in America, big book with great photo in the front. The English edition was a scruffy little thing. The American one was a really smart book. Pete Seeger buys it, sees these words, he's political, he loves it, and he thinks of oranges and lemons, and he thinks of that melody, and he puts it to music. Roger McGuinn hears Judy Collins singing it, takes it back to the Byrds sing it, and Bob Dylan then records it with the band. So that song wouldn't have got out there. You can see it if Dylan Thomas hadn't read it on the radio, have it go in a book, and it went to America. So that's the story, and it's a great story.
Yeah. So, well, I'll tell you what, the book is absolutely full of great stories. I mean, I'm not going to go through any more of them because I want people to buy your book. Yeah. But it's a fantastic book. So it really is fantastic. I mean, I read it within two or 3 days.
Yeah, it's an easy read, I think.
It's an easy read. Yeah, it just flows. Like it. Yeah. Because you've got the business of connecting from Bob to Dylan and Bob to Dylan all the way through. It's brilliant.
And what seems to happen is Dylan Thomas fans will buy it and read it for the Dylan Thomas stuff. They know some of it, but then they see the Bob Dylan stuff, and that's good. And the Bob Dylan fans, more Bob Dylan fans are getting in touch with me on social media saying, didn't know much about Dylan Thomas, didn't really know if it was true about his name and all of that. So it's kind of educating both sides of the fence.
Well, the book is called Bob Dylan and Dylan Thomas, The Two Dylans by K.G. Miles and Jeff Towns. Jeff, thanks for being my After Five guest today.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.